Ever since its first flight in 1969, the Boeing 747 has forged its place in aviation history as arguably one of the most iconic aircraft to ever grace the skies. The 747 is a marvel of engineering and a truly moving celebration of what humans can do when they work together. Since 1969, over 1,500 747s have been built. The very first 747, N747 is on display at the Museum of Flight in Seattle, Washington. It proudly stands as a reminder of a bygone era in air travel, and as the age of the 747 slowly fades into the rearview mirror of history, it and various other 747s on display across the world continue to keep its legacy alive. However, there's one 747 that I personally have a great interest for, one that arguably had a truly interesting and unusual story behind it. It's a 747 that is arguably almost as historic as the prototype, but whose story was bittersweet at first, noble overall, but eventually concluded with a truly heartbreaking ending. This is the story of the second Boeing 747 ever built, its early life, an accident it was involved in, its life in the spotlight after that, and an ending that truly is one of the most bizarre and emotional in aviation history. This is the story of Clipper Juan T Trippe, also known as N747PA. N747PA was completed on February 28, 1969. The aircraft was originally registered as N732PA, however it was later changed to the more iconic and recognized registration of N747PA. By that time, the aircraft had already accumulated over 3 hours of flight time. In its early days, N747PA was used as a testbed aircraft by Boeing. However, it already bared the paint scheme of its eventual owner by then, Pan American World Airways. Pan Am in many ways is the reason the 747 even exists, as, in the 1960s, the airline's legendary president, Juan T Trippe, had asked Boeing about building an aircraft that would be bigger than the Boeing 707. Boeing, knowing how important of a customer Pan Am was to them then, took on the task and, through that, led to the 747 taking to the skies. Although N747PA was destined to join the Pan Am fleet, she was instead used first by the airline on an extensive promotional tour across the United States to showcase to the public the newest aircraft Pan Am had to offer, as well as get them excited for the new plane. Instead, the honor of Pan Am's first delivered 747 and first to operate on a scheduled commercial flight was N736PA, the 11th 747 ever built. This aircraft, originally called Clipper Young America for the first flight and later Clipper Victor, would be destroyed in the Tenerife airport disaster after being struck by a KLM 747. To this day, it is the deadliest accident in aviation history. Back to N747PA, the aircraft made multiple stops along the way on its tour, such as Honolulu, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Miami, Philadelphia, and many more, including Bermuda. During the tour, thousands got to walk through the plane, and some lucky individuals even got to go on demonstration flights. Eventually, when the aircraft landed at Dulles International Airport on January 14, 1970, then First Lady Pat Nixon christened the aircraft and dubbed it Jet Clipper America. After that, N747PA joined the Pan Am fleet. Life would be relatively normal for the young aircraft for its first 9 months of service, but that all would change very quickly. The day was July 30th, 1971. N747PA was operating as Pan Am Flight 845 that day. Arriving to San Francisco from Los Angeles earlier that day, its destination was Tokyo Haneda Airport. On board were 199 passengers and 19 crew members. The flight crew consisted of 5: the captain, Calvin Dyer, First Officer Paul Oakes, Flight Engineer Winfrey Horn, as well as a relief flight engineer and pilot. Like most Pan Am flight crew, they were all highly experienced, but still relatively new to the 747, all having under 1,000 flying hours each on the aircraft. The plan was to take off from runway 28L. However, By the time the aircraft was pushed back, 28L had been closed for maintenance. So, they were instructed to take off from runway 01 right instead. 01 right was shorter than 28L and had less favorable wind conditions. To add on top of that all, the first 1,000 feet of it were closed too. Due to various misunderstandings, the crew were given a runway length that was much longer than what was actually available. They set flaps to 20 degrees instead of the original planned 10 degrees. However, they did not recalculate their takeoff reference speeds. Given that, as the 747 took off, these speeds were called out far too late than they should have been, prolonging the takeoff roll. Unable to gain enough altitude, N747PA struck the approach lights at the end of the runway. The damage was serious. One of the light beams penetrated the cabin and injured 2 passengers, with one having his foot nearly amputated off by it. The right main upper body landing gear was forced up into the fuselage, while the left landing gear was ripped loose and left dangling. 3 of the 4 hydraulic systems were taken out, as well as several wing and control surfaces, anti-skid control, 3 evacuation slides, and various other systems. The crew took N747PA over Half Moon Bay, and over the next hour and 42 minutes, dumped fuel and assessed the aircraft's damage. With aid from the US Coast Guard and with just 1 hydraulic system functioning, the crew attempted to land. The landing was hard. The aircraft bounced and then slid down the runway. Reverse thrust was only operational on engine 4. As the aircraft slowed down, it veered to the right and into the grass, luckily putting out a fire that had begun in the landing gear. Eventually, the aircraft came to a stop. Due to the missing landing gear and shift in center of gravity from dumping the fuel, N747PA settled on its tail with the nose up. Evacuation orders failed to be transmitted over the PA system, and so when 2 of the pilots went downstairs to assist the flight attendants, they were shocked to find everyone still seated and waiting to be told to evacuate. As mentioned earlier, evacuation slides were damaged in the collision, so only 6 of the slides worked. Given the tilt of the aircraft, most passengers evacuated out of the rear slides. However, some did go out of the front ones, which were either not working or no longer touching the ground due to the tilt. In the end, there were 29 injuries, with 8 requiring hospitalization. In their report, the National Transportation Safety Board concluded that pilot error was the cause of the accident, citing the crew's incorrect input of takeoff reference speeds and the unusual nature of the events that led up to the collision as the cause. Something rather incredible to note is that afterwards, it was found that metal debris had come within 10 centimeters of severing the last operational hydraulic line. Had this happened, there would have been no way the crew could have controlled the aircraft enough to attempt a landing. Flight attendant Amelia Deguer would later state that the disaster could have been far worse, but in many ways, the 747 itself saved them from possible disaster.
It could have been possibly the worst crash, but in my mind, the 747 saved our lives.
After such an accident and after sustaining that much damage, it seemed that N747PA's days were numbered and she would become possibly the first 747 to be scrapped. But this would not be the end of her story. Amazingly, despite the extent of the damage, N747PA was repaired over the course of 3 months, at a cost of $4.8 million USD, or $30.7 million USD in today's money. She was back in the skies soon after. Flight attendant Amelia Deguer stated how during a trans-Pacific flight a few months later, she was shocked to find out that it was the very same aircraft. According to her, she was about to run off the plane when the captain for the flight, Robert D. Larson, ran into her and convinced her to stay, on account of how beautifully N747PA had performed during her test flights. If he could fly her again, she could fly on her again too. Deguer would eventually grow a bond with the aircraft, and in Pan Am itself, she gained an almost mythical status. N747PA was the aircraft that had survived the unimaginable. With such a story and iconic registration tied to her, she became one of the most easily recognized planes in the Pan Am fleet. In 1973, Pan Am leased N747PA to Air Zaire. There, She was re-registered as N747QC and renamed to Mount Floyo. She flew with the airline for 19 months before returning to Pan Am and once again flying the legendary blue meatball on her tail. Back in Pan Am's hands, she got her iconic registration back and was renamed to Clipper Sealark. She would fly with that name from 1975 to 1980 when, following his death, Pan Am renamed the aircraft one final time after their legendary founder and aviation pioneer himself. Ergo, N747PA was now known as Clipper Juan T Trippe. This would be her most memorable name and the one she would retain for the rest of her life. After this, the 80s would be a relatively normal decade for the now 11-year-old N747PA. She continued flying for Pan Am, carrying people around the world. Over the course of her life, she would log over 76,000 flight hours and travel over 40 million miles, carrying around 4 million passengers in the process. In January 1988, as part of the U.S. Department of Defense's airlift requirements under the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, N747PA was modified, receiving a side cargo door and reinforced floor. She would be used for transporting troops during the Gulf War. Apart from that, N747PA led a relatively normal life under Pan Am. But all that would change on December 4th, 1991.
We are very sorry to advise you that Pan American Airways has suspended operations. All flights are canceled.
On December 4th, 1991, after 64 years in the sky, Pan Am ceased operations. A year prior, in 1990, N747PA had been sold by Pan Am to General Electric Credit Corporation, but continued to operate for them as a leased aircraft. The day after Pan Am shuttered, GECC took back ownership of N747PA. She would soon become the sole occupant of Hangar 19 at JFK International Airport and eventually the last 747 with Pan Am's logo on her tail there. On May 12, 1992, N747PA was rolled out of the hangar to a crowd of former Pan Am employees. It was an emotional moment. For them, it was the end of the runway. Many had devoted their lives to Pan Am, and now it was all over. Clipper Juan T Trippe was not only the last 747 Pan Am had left, but she was in all intents and purposes the airline's flagship as well. And she was departing. With her departure, it was indeed the end of what once was the world's most experienced airline.
Former Pan Am workers and the few who still work for the bankrupt airline came to bid farewell to not only their first 747, but also an era.
After signing their names on the fuselage, N747PA began her taxi to the runway, but not before getting a water cannon salute from the New York Port Authority fire trucks. Once taking off, she made a final low-level pass along the runway for the crowd, before disappearing into the horizon. And with that, ended the era of not only Pan Am, but their 747s having a presence in the skies of the city that never sleeps.
You were the first and the last of the great Pan American Clippers. We wish you Godspeed on your journey. Clipper Juan T Trippe.
After arriving in San Bernardino, California, she would be stripped of her Pan Am markings. Later that year, GECC would end up leasing her to Argentinian airline Aeroposta. She would operate with them for a while, remarkably not only retaining her iconic registration of N747PA, but also her final name. Even post-Pan Am, she was still known as Clipper Juan T Trippe. N747PA would lead a relatively uneventful career as a freighter, but not too long after, her days in the sky would soon come to an end. With her airframe approaching the need for a major D-check, the fact she no longer conformed to new noise criteria, and the fact she was now approaching 25 years old, N747PA was grounded. She would be dismantled over the next few years in San Bernardino, serving as a donor plane for parts needed to keep other 747 classics still in service going. But eventually, in 1999, 30 years on from her first flight, she was broken up. However, even faced with scrapping, N747PA would once again cheat debt for one final and very unusual time. In 2000, what remained of N747PA was purchased by a South Korean couple for about 1 million USD. By that point, what remained of the plane was no longer fit to fly. N747PA's days as a plane in the normal sense were over. But this couple had another plan for the old plane. A rather weird one at that. They had the remains of N747PA sliced up and loaded into shipping containers. She was then shipped to South Korea and rebuilt in Namyangju, a city northeast of Seoul. There, she was painted in a way to sort of look like the Boeing VC-25As, which are used to transport the US presidents, and converted into, of all things, a noodle restaurant called the Jumbo 747. Back in the early 2000s, there was a sort of fad that involved taking decommissioned aircraft and turning them into restaurants in Korea. N747PA was just one of the many that had popped up across the country. But like most fads, it was short-lived. Many of those plane restaurants would eventually fail. Sadly, old N747PA would be one of them. The restaurant failed in 2005, and for several years, Clipper Juan T Trippe would lie abandoned and rusting away. Many would visit and document the ever-decaying state of this truly historical and remarkable aircraft. The internet is full of images on old blogs and news articles from the mid to late 2000s, with photos of both the exterior and interior of the plane. They showcase the ever-deteriorating and depressing state of the once proud and iconic aircraft. Like with Aeroposta, despite the new paint job, she still bared her Clipper Juan T Trippe name on her nose. Over 40 years old, N747PA's life would soon, however, come to a grim and tragic end. On December 13th, 2010, the Los Angeles Times ran an article that confirmed the worst. N747PA had been scrapped. After the couple failed to find a buyer for the aging aircraft, her final fate was to be demolished and sold for scrap. For them, as stated in the article, the scrapping of the aircraft marked the end of a bad business investment on their end. But, I guess for me and other aviation enthusiasts around the world, it was a truly depressing fate for a truly remarkable aircraft. Such a remarkable plane didn't need to go this way. In a documentary about the 747 made in 2014, N747PA's story was told, and Amelia Deguer also expressed her truly emotional thoughts on the depressing end for a plane she, like so many others, had truly fallen in love with.
Why couldn't they have kept an airplane like her, for all posterity?
And with that, it seemed that N747PA's story was finally over. The legendary second 747 ever built, that flew for Pan Am, faced and cheated death multiple times, and was named after one of the most important individuals in aviation history, had finally met its maker. Or did it? Because, as far as some people are concerned, N747PA still exists. Despite the fact that N747PA was reported to have been scrapped in 2010, there were rumors that she may not entirely have been destroyed. But of course, no one really could prove them. At least until 2017. This was around the time that I began getting interested in the odd story of N747PA. One day, towards the end of the year, while browsing the web, I came across an article on airwaysmagazine.com. Written by Cody Diamond, this article provided supposed proof that yes, the legendary plane still existed. In the article, Cody states that he was in Seoul to cover the last intercontinental 747 flights by United Airlines. While there, he set out to find possible leads on what happened to N747PA, as well as get to the bottom of a mystery in the same town the aircraft once stood. There was an unidentifiable 747 in the city of Namyangju that was being converted into a church. There were no markings on its exterior according to this article that would give one its identity. But with that fact in mind, and the fact that it was in the same town as N747PA once stood, there was a chance that it could have been the same plane. When arriving to it, Cody mentions how he very quickly found evidence to prove that it was indeed N747PA, such as weld marks where the aircraft had been supposedly cut up when it was shipped to Korea. He also found evidence supposedly of its old paint job, so that in turn left no doubt. Speaking with the owner, Cody states that according to him, in 2010, N747PA was not entirely scrapped like the LA Times article had said, but that 3 major sections of its fuselage were saved and spliced together to make what exists now, which was a slightly shorter aircraft than a Boeing 747 SP. But despite that, it was in fact the same plane. So there we go, right? That's a happy sounding ending to some extent. N747PA is still in one way or another around, and you could travel to Namyangju right now and check it out. Right? Well, it's not that way. See, this article is almost too good sounding to be true. And that's because, sadly, it is. While doing research for this video, I came across an article in the Korea Times about the jet restaurant fad from 20 years ago. The highlight of these articles was about the writer, Ron Bandam, and his experience with these aircraft and exploring the many abandoned ones and more. Like all articles mentioned, it will be linked in the description below. Towards the end of the article, Ron talks about the same 747 church from the Air Magazine article, which he visited in the summer of 2010. Immediately, there's an issue. The LA Times article on N747PA being scrapped was published in December 2010, so already there's something not right. And alas, that is the case as, below, Ron talks about the article on N747PA still being around and debunks it as, quote, a totally erroneous article. He then provides more proof of that claim by showing screenshots of both aircraft on Street View maps. The 747 Church screenshot was taken in January 2010, while the one of N747PA was taken in February 2010. Basically speaking, the Air Magazine article is wrong. N747PA is not the 747 Church. She's gone. The second 747 ever built truly was scrapped completely that cold December morning in 2010. She was not salvaged. She no longer exists. Period. To add to all of this, while doing further research to find more articles about the fate of the aircraft, I found a comment that linked to a Flickr album from 2010 by user Lena Maria. There's 7 photos in total, and they showcase the demolishing of N747PA. 2 of these photos put completely to rest any doubt that may still exist about whether or not that Church 747 is N747PA. One of the pieces laying on the ground bears the aircraft's name, Clipper Juan T Trippe. As that section of the fuselage was located at the very front of the plane, that pretty much erases any possibilities that the front of the plane was salvaged, as Air Magazine's article claimed, and spliced and saved into the church building. This is the final nail in the coffin. It really is true. N747PA is gone. She really is gone. For a while after the Air Magazine article was made, Planespotters.net, which has a list of the status of every 747 ever built, updated N747PA's status to being preserved rather than scrapped. However, it has since reverted it. Officially though on there, it still has the aircraft mistakenly identified as the Church 747, which seems to also no longer exist as of 2020 given, while looking at street views of the area that were made in June 2021, the Church 747 has been removed and replaced with a new building, though why, I'm not sure. Exactly which 747 this is to begin with is still also unknown. But of course, given all the evidence presented, it is certain that it isn't, and never was, N747PA. With Boeing having announced that production of the 747 is to come to an end in 2022, we really are nearing the twilight era of the age of the jumbo jet. With no new aircraft being built and the few non-8 models still flying nearing the end of their lives, we're approaching a time when there will probably be more 747s sitting in deserts than flying in the skies. And while yes, the 747-8 and various other models still out there will mean that the 747 will still fly for decades to come, it is still hard to accept that the day the last airworthy 747 lands for the final time is now not a matter of if, but when. But until then, we still have a long time left to enjoy the 747. The Queen of the Skies is not going away anytime soon. Over the past 54 years, over 1,500 have taken to the skies, but as we've seen, none really had quite the adventure that the second one of them all did. A 747 that bared an aviation legend's name. A 747 that flew for one of the greatest airlines to ever exist and became its effective flagship. A plane that cheated death so many times that, when her time did finally come, people still believed she survived it too. And at the end of it all, a 747 that really did capture the heart and soul of so many that both flew on her and took the time to hear her story. Though N747PA may be gone, her legacy and story surely are not. And so long as someone is out there who wishes to hear it, the story of the second 747 ever built will never truly be forgotten. This has been a TTM Productions video, and thank you for watching.
Experience is knowing what to do. We've done it all.